I'm going to give is really about Hurston and how when she was writing, when she was entering the intelligentsia of the Harlem Renaissance, she was also really interested in anthropology as a discourse and as a discipline. So when a lot of people read Their Eyes Are Watching God, they think about Janie and her, how the narrative is about her coming into being and getting to understand herself. When we read it in conjunction with her anthropological work, she's also using the narrative as a way to speak back to what anthropology could not give her. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to start first with a short reading from the essay that Dr. Durant actually talked about, How It Feels to Be a Colored Me. So in her 1928 essay, Zora Neale Hurston describes how the only white people she knew in her early childhood were tourists driving through her town in Eatonville, Florida. She writes, quote, "The native whites rode dusty horses. The northern tourists chugged down the sandy village road in automobiles. The town knew the southerners and never stopped cane chewing when they passed. But the northerners were something else again. They were peered at cautiously from behind the curtains by the timid. The more venturesome would come out onto the porch to watch them go past and got as much pleasure out of the tourists as the tourists got out of the village." Understanding that whites from the region were typically on horseback, while more modernized northerners drove in cars, this account describes an awareness of whiteness through a reciprocated practice of looking, a practice fraught with an unambiguous desire. Reacting to a regional classification of whites, the members of Eatonville turned northerners into objects of curiosity, where they were peered at cautiously through windows or more boldly observed from front porches. Whether fearful or venturesome, the townspeople approached whites with an implicit awareness of segregation, and that whites were not to be engaged with directly. Still, she observes that they maintained a distance as if they were to get just as much pleasure out of the tourists as the tourists got from the village. In sharp contrast, Hurston would confidently and perhaps naively perch her younger self not just on the front porch, but on a post to put her in the best position to observe and actively engage passersby. She writes, quote, "The front porch might seem a daring place for the rest of the town, but it was a gallery seat for me. My favorite place was atop the gatepost. Not only did I enjoy the show, but I didn't mind the actors knowing that I liked it." Here, if the front porch and the gatepost are like a gallery seat, the white tourists become the visual field that serves her viewing pleasure. While Hurston admits to having no qualms about expressing her joy in the fleeting interactions with whites, she also understands that her own community frowned down at her conversations and deplored any joyful tendencies in her. So here, the dynamics of looking, of performing, and consuming performance become more tense when she describes how the whites, quote, "liked to hear me speak pieces, sing and dance, and gave me generously of their small silver for doing things, which seemed strange to me, for I wanted to do them so much that I needed bribing to stop. Only they didn't know it." Though she shares her songs and dances liberally, she is also unintentionally busking, implicitly satisfying a curiosity of Southern rural blackness for the white tourists. Still, Hurston refuses to acknowledge her objectification as a black child. Instead, her narrative focuses on the strange behavior and the ignorance of the white tourists, and centering her own pleasure in this performance as well. In some ways, this account paints Hurston's early childhood as idyllic. Eatonville was a place where she could be different, even outlandish, and trust that her community would not relinquish her. She, quote, "belonged to them, to the nearby hotels, to the county, everybody's Zora." She could confidently enjoy performing for others and consume their attention. Most notably, any sense of her racial awareness was absent. She writes, quote, "White people differed from colored to me only in that they rode through town and never lived there. And in fact, it is when she is sent away from Eatonville to attend a boarding school in Jacksonville, Florida, that she declares that that is where she becomes colored. And so, it's implicit that that's where she's learning about the violence of systemic racism, that she does not belong. So I've dwelled on Hurston's recollection here because I want to suggest that this is an early engagement for Hurston with observation, with power, and that both of these interests become much more prominent when she actually does ethnography and as she's doing her fiction writing, so they kind of intersect. It's also significant that she writes and publishes this essay as she's completing her studies as an anthropology major at Columbia University, under the instruction of Franz Boas. So that is him. He is considered the father of anthropology in the U.S. context. He established the first PhD granting department at Columbia. And so Hurston was a part of a very select group of people who was invited to do graduate studies with him. So after earning her undergraduate degree, and sorry, it was not at Columbia, it was at Barnard College, she would continue her graduate studies with Boas for 2 more years, conducting more ethnographic work in Florida and then the Caribbean. From Boas, she would acquire what she later called, quote, the spyglass of anthropology, to understand the racialized contours of her childhood experiences and to valorize the lives of rural Black folk in the U.S. and the Caribbean. So Boas' anthropology is undergirded by a theoretical framework, methodology, and central objects of study that align well with her interests. First, Boasian anthropology transformed the definition of culture, like what culture meant. Before, it was understood to be the domain of the elite. So when you were cultivated, you were learning arts, you were learning languages and Romance languages, you were learning poetry, you were learning fine arts. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there was physical culture that people were looking at. Like, if you think about archaeology, they were looking at objects, artifacts, and primitive tools to find ways and as clues for the ways that primitive societies were organized. But what Boas does is he kind of combines these interests and adds another layer of complexity. So in his understanding, culture included the behaviors, it includes the beliefs and practices of all people, right? But also to understand that those beliefs and cultures, those beliefs and practices were constantly changing, and they depended upon the perspective of those who were actually recording the stories and the details of another culture. So the anthropological lens of culture that Hurston studied would also include folklore, which was a highly valuable empirical material of culture that if we properly compiled it according to Boas, if we methodically analyzed it, we could shed light on the core values of cultures that were dissipating or threatened by modernity, and specifically thinking about the rise of technology, industrialization, migration patterns, and also commercialization. So in fact, it's important to think about this when we're reading Their Eyes Are Watching God, because that publication is preceded by Meals and Men, which is her ethnographic study of Florida, and it's immediately followed by Tell My Horse, which is a study of voodoo. Well, it says voodoo, but it's just general folklore in Haiti and Jamaica. So she's doing both of these, all at the same time, writing fiction and doing academic ethnographic work. So it might make sense. Another thing to think about in addition to the Boasian approach to culture is that it also privileged local culture, right? And it thought not only about human diversity through a general global lens, it was emphasizing that it was through local culture that we could undercut and challenge a perception of civilization as something that is stable, that is universal, and that is uniform. And instead, if you did ethnography correctly, you could prove that culture was dynamic, and that it could also prove that cultures, racial, ethnic groups were not essential, that there was actually something dynamic and different across groups, and then within groups as well. So it might make sense to think about why Hurston returns to Florida in her fiction and in her academic research. With a disciplinary focus, she could reapproach the culture of Florida, and specifically the rural Black community there, through a lens that was undoubtedly shaped by aspirations of other contemporary Black cultural producers. Listening, looking, documenting, and narrating cultural differences in their environmental contexts could show her audience that Blackness was not only different regionally, but that the meaning of Blackness was heterogeneous and informed by shifting economic, environmental, and migratory contexts. In Hurston's perspective specifically, rural Black culture had not yet been commercialized, like jazz and neo-spiritual records, which were becoming popular at the time. And as she also felt that it was woefully underlooked and underappreciated. And so that was part of her understanding of herself as a researcher, that she was going to bring attention to this culture and to this folk culture to a broader audience and an academic audience as well. So the narrative I begin with also suggests that Hurston's return to Florida and then her interest in Haiti and the Caribbean had something to do with her early dynamics with the white tourists. These tourists saw her as a fanciful diversion and as a Black spectacle, and then they would drive away. So what would be different if the lens she provided with the lives of Eatonville, what could be provided if she gave them a more sustained engagement with, and then also if she could weave stories, longer stories, novels, out of the experiences of her childhood. So this reminds me of when she actually talks about Nanny, and Nanny is trying to get her, or implore her to get married. Nanny actually explains that, when in the struggles that she had as a youth, what saved her was, quote, getting in quotation with people. Now, this is a very curious phrase. What does this mean, to get in quotation with people? Does anyone have any ideas or any thoughts about that? You have a thought? No? It's something that I think is puzzling. Any interpretations? No?
Just to talk to them.
Just to talk to them, yeah. I mean, I think it's about conversation, right? But the idea of the quotation, too, in writing, in our writing system, is that it's also about recording and remembering. So I think that idea about recording but also conversing with people was very important for her in understanding how she could represent accurately, but also how she can actually contribute to the knowledge that Dr. Durand talked about as well, with, as a central concern of the novel. So Hurston wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God during a 7-week stay in Haiti. Right? So she's doing ethnographic work as she's writing this novel. And she's going to use that material for Tell My Horse, which is published in 1938. So as she's employing academic research methods of cultural anthropology, observing and participating in local practices, ceremonies, and folklore in a Haitian community, she was also immersed in the literary production of a fictional journey of and putting a Black woman at center. The novel introduces protagonist Janie Starks returning home in ragged overalls in the evening time, when the people of her towns are spending their time on their front porches. In a neutral tone, the narrator explains the states of their mind, and this is a long quote. Quote, "The people all saw her come because it was sundown. It was the time for sitting on porches beside the road. It was the time to hear things and talk. These sitters had been tongueless, earless, eyeless conveniences all day long. Seeing the woman as she was made them remember the envy they had stored up from other times. The men noticed her firm buttocks. She had grapefruits in her hip pockets, the great rope of Black hair swinging, then her pugnacious breasts trying to bore holes. They, the men, were saving with their mind what they lost with the eye." So from the opening paragraphs, this narrative opening underscores how Janie, who we learn through the course of the story, is an independent, aesthetically very attractive woman, how she's going to become the object of the reader's study. But even as the local people critique her way, providing some backstory to the reader about the men in her lives, She also knows that she can return here and resume a place in the town. While the thematic of observation in these lines seem to reduce her to parts, it's also clear that the act of observation here is loaded with emotion, with histories and desire. In other words, it's loaded with partiality. Looking at Janie, the women not only see her as a distant neighbor, they are also reminded of the past envy that they had stored up from other times, while the men visually consume her body in parts, remembering the vision that they see for the future. Here, the novel suggests that the act of observation is always biased and informed by the desires and limitations of the observer. In this case, they are resting after a day's work as tongueless, earless, and eyeless laborers without expression or sensual reception. The narrative then turns into a kind of meta-narrative, a story that tries to supersede what the locals are telling about her. And it unfolds into a broader, more complicated narrative about the various lessons she has learned about love, marriage, and herself. However, Janie's response to the community is indirect. She transmits her story to her closest friend Phoebe, who is then tasked with passing on some version of the story, whatever that is, to other members of the community. That Janie responds to the idle gossip of the men and women on their porches with a story gives some insight into the possibilities of the story in exploding the quick judgments and the normative assumptions being made of Janie's exceptional position. And she's exceptional because she's a property woman during a time when to own property as a woman and as a black woman was not very common. So within the story, there's a few scenes of observation, and I'm not sure about time, but I want to talk about one scene, and that is when Nanny, Janie's grandmother and lone caregiver, sees that she has kissed a young man over the gatepost, and that gatepost kind of comes up again and again. Calling to Janie immediately, Nanny declares that Janie has come of age and pushes her to marry a local man, Logan Killix. And with that, Janie declares, quote, that was the end of her childhood. So it's through this act of observing, right, without actually interrogating or engaging Janie in the story behind what was she thinking, what was happening before she kissed this young man, that leads to her grandmother, her nanny, to suddenly say, you need to get married, right? They're the loaded assumptions about what that kiss means. And so, you know, what unfolds is all of the kind of, the ways that this initiation into marriage is actually going to be about her finding herself, right? She believes that marriage equals love. With her first husband, she finds out that that's absolutely not the case. And with her second relationship with Joe Starks, she finds out she you know has it's a stronger connection, but she also learns that it doesn't last, and there are shifting tides, there are shifting histories and economic contexts that are all going to determine the dynamics of that relationship. And Joe Starks is a city man. He is individualistic, he's ambitious, he's business-oriented, and in many ways he embodies the history of U.S. capital. What does that, you know, in what way? He finds his power through the enforced labor of rural folk. So if you've read the narrative, you know he's kind of made the townsfolk build trenches in front of his store. And they say to themselves, there's a quote where they murmured hotly about slavery being over. And they still do it, but they understand that there's a dynamic here that seems very abusive and exploitative. Janie, in Joe's project, becomes another object to add to his gallery. He firmly plants her as a store clerk. He controls the way she dresses. She becomes an object to be observed. And he limits her ability to express her own observations. So, you know, one of the things that she does learn through Joe, however, is that there is something about folk culture that she becomes enamored with. She says, quote, when the people sat down on the front porch and passed around the pictures of their thoughts for others to look and see, it was nice. The fact that the thought pictures were always crayon enlargements of life made it even nicer to listen to. That Janie translates the pictures that others share is significant in that it invites them to participate, as the story of the Yellow Mule, which I don't have time to go into, but if you read the novel, you know that this is about, you know, how a town becomes interested in an animal that can't talk back. And when that mule dies, Janie is left to tend to the store. She wants to attend the funeral. But Joe, again, comes in and he blocks her from participating in that ceremony. So this is a moment then to think about. She is doing ethnographic work at this moment, participating in ceremonies, and yet she's narrating the experience of Janie as being excluded from that community. So Joe continues to exclude Janie from participating in the dynamics of storytelling. Quote, when Lige or Sam or Walter or some of the other big picture talkers were using a side of the world for the canvas, Joe would hustle her off inside the store to sell something. So their mutual resentment builds, and after a particularly brutal fight, Joe slaps Janie for making a bad dinner. Janie realizes that her image of Jody was, quote, tumbled down and shattered. But looking at it, she saw that it was never the flesh and blood figure of her dreams, just something she grabbed up to drape her dreams over. Realizing that Joe, like the store, like everything in the store, was simply a thing, an object, rather than the flesh and blood that she had fallen for, she actually comes to an understanding that things need to change. And they do, by luck, because Joe Starks dies. So while continuing to tend to the store, right, she's not in a rush to move on, but she is very contemplative. She begins to dream again, and she says she had, quote, she had been getting ready for her great journey to the horizons in search of people. It was important to all the world that she could find them and they could find her. But she had been whipped like a cur dog and run off down a back road after things. Yeah. So she puts an emphasis on people versus things here. And this emphasis, I think, is actually tied to the tension of the anthropological vision. Like, what does it mean to observe people and their practices and write them down and turn it into a book for people to then buy, right? It is a process of objectification in some way. So the relationship with Tea Cake that follows becomes Janie's dream come true in Lost. And Tea Cake is also the one who brings her even closer to the folk in the Everglades where black laborers worked on seasonal farms. And then after a devastating hurricane, Tea Cake eventually dies, and returning home, Janie unfolds the rich complexity of her experience on the back porch with her friend Phoebe. And she shares what she wants to say to the rest of the town, but she doesn't want to do it herself. Answering the town's immediate suspicions, and they all think that Tea Cake has run off with her money, she concludes her story with a demand. She says, then you must tell him that love ain't nothing like a grindstone. That's the same thing everywhere, and that do the same thing to everything it touch. Love is like the sea. It's a moving thing, and still and all, it takes its shape from the shore it meets, and it's different with every shore. Whether or not the message reaches the townspeople, we don't know. The difficulty with Janie's claim here is that love, like culture, is attendant. It's attendant to anyone's particular beliefs and practices. It's persistently shifting, and it can never be captured in a total form. It always has to be from one person's perspective. So the anthropological vision that Hurston is contending with at the same time is also a struggle over vision. It's about representing local folk cultures without flattening or exoticizing their characteristics and feeding it into readers' presumptions or anticipations about what these foreign cultures should be like. So, I want to end the discussion here because of time, but also because I want to return to a question about why Hurston's engagement with the people in the field of anthropology was also supplemented by her fictional work. And it's important to note that Hurston's fieldwork in Haiti was under the patronage of a white philanthropist, Mrs. Osgood Mason, and she did not have any proprietary claims over her research and any publications that came out of it. So the fictional world that Janie inhabits is somewhat about Hurston's own struggle as an intellectual, as a writer, as a product, and as a producer of folk culture. And whereas her position as an ethnographer required her to listen and look carefully, Their Eyes Were Watching God is about being listened and being read. So I just want to conclude with one note here. African-Americanist scholar Hazel Carby makes a critical observation that Their Eyes Are Watching God may have become, quote, the most frequently taught Black novel because it acts as a mode of assurance that really the Black folk are happy and healthy. Here, Carby is not necessarily implicating that the text is complicit in appealing to a white readership. Rather, she suggests that there is a structure of belief, of white supremacist longing, that has received and reinforced the repopularization of the novel in the 1970s when Hurston's body of work was rediscovered by Black feminist writers and Black scholars. So if we take Carby's question to task, it might make sense to understand that this is a moment, we live in a moment today when Black and brown bodies are subject to premature death, socially through the prisons and policing, biologically through a variety of structural racisms, environmental and education, and that perhaps Hurston's contradictory yet committed interrogations into the possibilities and impossibilities of diligent observation as a mode of knowledge teaches us about the failures of distant and disengaged study. As Janie tells Phoebe, quote, you got to go there to know there. And if we cannot go there, we might listen more carefully to the story and experiences of others, knowing that we view those narratives through the silences and the hurt that we have ourselves. Thank you.